We are so deeply indoctrinated within Western society to believe that without police, that violence would ensue. It would suddenly become like Mad Max, like everything would just fall apart and we'd suddenly just turn on one another. Like, I don't think that's too much of a stretch to say that that is pretty much what society believes, but I'm here to tell you that that is propaganda, bro. That is nothing but propaganda. It's what the ruling class wants us to believe, right? We don't even question why policing exists in the first place. Policing didn't suddenly emerge because the ruling class decided that public safety was needed. Policing emerged because the ruling class needed a tool to control the masses, particularly Black, brown, poor, disabled, anybody who fit outside the socially acceptable parameters, right? We know that. So it started with slave catchers, slave patrols in the US, so-called US, to colonial enforcement like residential school enforcers that rounded up kids violently and criminalized their families if they didn't submit to the state and sending their kids to residential schools. Like, that is where policing started, right? So it's the same in the US, where policing emerged from slave catchers to so-called Canada to the RCMP, which is now the known federal police force, right? So now, of course, we know policing to be largely justified to enforce the most ineffective system in the world, which is the drug war, which really only existed in the first place to target racialized Black and brown people and, of course, poor people. And now it targets migrants and anybody who's racialized and also doesn't fit within socially acceptable parameters. Same fucking thing, different era. And anybody with half a brain knows that police don't prevent harm, they respond to it. They show up after to re-traumatize, escalate, and enforce violent laws and rules. And if you're rich, then you're more likely to get out of those things. It's fucked up that I need to say this, but abolition is not liberalism, okay? The hysterical right love to call abolitionists liberals when liberalism actually has more in common with conservatives. Abolition, despite popular belief, is rooted in evidence and science and history. And really, to sum it up, it is the reallocation of funding away from policing institutions and into evidence-based and humane systems that build community rather than isolation, like healthcare, community infrastructure for literal proximity of community, to dismantling the war on drugs, to culturally safe and dignified supports, to indigenous governance systems and land back, and the universal childcare, universal income, food security, all those things that are required to build a society with overall good well-being, rather than only a small percentage of those people being well, right? And there is, like I said, tons of fucking evidence that shows this. Abolition is and always has been evidence-based. And the thing is, predominantly white suburban communities already do things that are more in line with abolition than anything. They would just never utter that word. They have systems within their communities that prevent harm, right? They have problem-solving strategies. They have fundraising strategies to support their kids in playing sports. They have collective care embedded within their normal routines. They just also happen to be bootlickers that don't relate to any of the shit that I'm saying because they're only for themselves, right? And I think another part of what abolition means is taking responsibility for each other, right? Because we've strayed so far away under individualism from the collective thought that we don't even bat an eye when our neighbors, our loved ones, or people within our own community are suffering and starving, right? Under an abolitionist and collective care mindset, my neighbor in the park would be fed, would be housed, would be clothed, right? And that just brings me to think about also how not too long ago this white security guard said some stupid shit to me, saying, I was just intervening with him harassing an unhoused person, and he's like, why don't you bring all the homeless people then? And I was like, well, care is not like that to me, right? Joke's on you. I actually do have an open door, but that's another conversation, right? But that just shows the way that individualist mindsets have just swallowed us whole. And at the end of the day, we are better off under a world where we don't have to rely on police and punitive systems. So anyways, we see other examples of alternatives to policing in so many other avenues, like drug user liberation spaces and indigenous governance systems, as I said before, and mutual aid collectives. And it's literally just neighbors checking on neighbors. And having safety plans for if our neighbor or a loved one is feeling suicidal or self-harm, then we don't rely on police. We just come together as a community, and that shouldn't be so unheard of. We shouldn't feel that this is a disruption to our life when we are called to support a friend. Anyway, point is that communities exist every day without having to call police in crisis, right? We also know that in Denmark, there is a completely self-sustaining village called Christiania. We see the Umoja village in Kenya, which is a self-supporting village run by and for women that flee domestic abuse and sexual assault. It completely operates without police and punitive measures, right? So there are far more examples of this. The point is, the question shouldn't be what would we do without police. It should rather be what becomes possible when we dream of a world where nobody is disposable, where policing is no longer necessary, where punishing survival and poverty and substance use and mental health no longer exists. This is possible. It requires labor, it requires education, and it requires us to get our heads out of our asses. Anybody else in?